There was a whopping 2,059 brand new Magic the Gathering cards printed in 2024, which is an absolute staggering amount of cards to go through if you're a Commander player looking to find sweet Commander cards to add to your decks. So in this video, I'm going to try and help out by showing you my favorite budget Commander cards that were printed last year. All these cards are currently priced at around $2 or less, which means they're all basically bulk cards. You're going to find them in your own bulk bins, your friends' bulk binders, and also at the game store. It's going to be readily available cards for you. I'm going to give you my top 10 monocolor cards, 10 for each monocolor, and then multicolor, and then finally top 10 colorless cards. We begin with the top 10 budget white cards, and we kick things off with definitely the most played card that is on Commander Clash at the very least, and a card that I play a ton in a lot of my own decks, and that is Sand Scout. This is a 2-mana white human scout 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for a desert card, put it onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle, and then whenever one or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, create a 1/1 red, green, and white Sand Warrior creature token. This ability triggers only once each turn. So this card is yet another catch-up ramp card for white decks. It's very similar to other 2-mana creatures with the ETB catch-up ramp mechanic, like Loyal Warhound and Knight of the White Orchid. All of them have their ups and downs. Loyal Warhound, I think, is the weakest because it only gets basic land, basic plains, and puts it on the battlefield tapped. Knight of the White Orchid is very, very strong and was my favorite of the three, at least until 2024, because it gets any plains, even non-basic plains, and it enters untapped. Sand Scout, though, is a little bit different. So this one actually gets deserts. It can't actually get any basic lands. It can't get plains or whatever. It can only get deserts. And that could be narrow, but at the same time, it's also a massive upside because the type of deserts you're going to get are going to be way more impactful than the plains you're usually getting with Knight of the White Orchid or Loyal Warhound. One of the best options out there is definitely Arid Archway. This is a bounce land that is a desert. So you tutor it up with Sand Scout, you put the bounce land onto the battlefield. It's ramped because it taps for 2 mana, but it requires you to return a land back to your hand, which means even though you're ramping, you're not actually going up in land count. And that's really important for white catch-up ramp because the white catch-up ramp cards all require you to have a lower land count than your opponents. So any way of actually ramping up in mana while not actually going up in actual land count is super powerful. So like the bounce lands and Arid Archway are going to be fantastic options here. And that's what makes Sand Scout so powerful. Like your first tutor target is always going to be Arid Archway, and that means subsequent Sand Scout triggers or Knight of the White Orchid triggers or whatever are still going to be online. This hasn't really changed the math at all. And then beyond that, there's other powerful deserts you can be tutoring up as well. If you're in a aristocrat style deck, a sacrifice style deck, tutoring up Lazotep Quarry is just so powerful. So these type of cards are just so powerful, much more powerful than just getting a regular plains or whatever. So bounce lands are just amazing with white catch-up ramp in general. So stuff like Azorius Chancery is going to be really good with Sand Scout effects. But then also Sand Scout has a full other paragraph of text, which is wild. It actually makes creature tokens. And I basically ignored that text for 90% of my Sand Scout usages. Like even if that text didn't even exist, I still think it would be like a phenomenal ramp in basically any white deck that's not in green. But then on top of that, if you're putting lands into your graveyard from anywhere, either a battlefield or you're self-milling, however you're doing it, you're also getting 1/1 creature tokens for free, essentially, which works well with, welcoming vampire effects, a dozen other white synergy cards too. So just like running fetch lands is suddenly way better with Sand Scout as well. And then of course, if you're doing any self-milling shenanigans, it gets even better. I'd run Sand Scout in basically any white deck that isn't in green, because if I'm in a green deck, I'm just going to be running just generic land ramp cards like Farseek, Rampant Growth, Nature's Lord, those sort of things. And those kind of turn off your white catch-up ramp. They don't really work well together. So if I'm in a green-white deck, then when I'm not running these type of effects. But if I'm outside of green, Sand Scout is basically an auto include in those decks. Another card that I run in a ton of my white decks now, the same thing, white catch-up ramp, it's Claim Jumper. And while I would put Sand Scout as basically number 1 slot, this is basically number 2 for me now. Claim Jumper is 3 mana, 3/3, Rabbit Mercenary. It has Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you may search the library for a Plains card and put it onto the battlefield tap. Then if an opponent controls more lands than you, repeat this process once. So basically, this is another catch-up ramp card, but it has the potential of ramping out 2 lands instead of just 1, and that is wild value. Again, the same stuff that I mentioned about turning on catch-up ramp for Sand Scout applies here too. Bounce lands work really well with it. Lotus Field or Lotus Veil, whichever one has hexproof, works really well with Claim Jumper too. And basically, if you can just ramp out 1 land with Claim Jumper, it's already quite good. And then if you can ramp out 2, it's just, so much value. And while it cannot get deserts, it can fetch any non-basic plains. So if you're in a 2-color or 3-color deck, if you're in a 3-color deck, you can get a Triumph. If you're in a 2-color deck, you can get like a Surveil land or a Shock land, whatever you have on you. So it's really powerful in mana fixing. It might not have the absolute insane utility of getting like an Arid Archway or something like that, but the mana fixing it can't be downplayed. We move on to a very powerful but narrow draw engine and threat in the air, which is Exemplar of Light. This is a 4 mana 3/3 angel with flying, and it says whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and whenever you put 1 or more +1/+1 counters on this creature, you draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So basically, if you are in any sort of life gain deck, if you're gaining at least 1 life per turn cycle, you're drawing at least 1 card. So that's a Phyrexian Arena that is on an angel that grows into a huge flying threat that can just kill your opponents, protect your life total, and eventually just grow big enough to just start murdering your opponents with flying. But obviously, that is like the minimum that you would expect from Exemplar of Light. Like if you put this in a life gain deck, you're at minimum probably drawing at least 1 card on your turn. But in a 4-player free-for-all game, if you manage to consistently gain life on your opponent's turns as well, you can draw up to 4 cards per turn cycle. If you draw 1 card on your turn and then 1 card on each of your 3 opponents' turn, in a single turn cycle, you're drawing 4 cards a turn, and you're putting 4 +1/+1 counters on Exemplar of Light, which is bananas. And that sounds very far-fetched. That sounds like it would take a lot of work, right? But no, if you have like the Soul Warden effects, that becomes very easy to trigger Exemplar of Light on your opponent's turns, as long as they're, playing a single creature. Same thing if you have like Campbell on the battlefield. As long as they're playing a single non-creature spell on their turn, you're going to be triggering the life gain aspect of it, and you're going to be putting +1/+1 counters on Exemplar of Light and drawing beautiful, beautiful cards. This is arguably the strongest draw engine in a life gain deck ever. It's so mana efficient, and it comes with a huge ever-growing body. And then another life gain card that I feel is a little bit underlooked is Case of the Uneaten Feast. So it's a 1 mana enchantment case, and it says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life, and then to solve, you have to have gained 5 or more life this turn. And then when it's solved, at any point in time, you can sacrifice the case and then just play creature cards from your graveyard directly onto the battlefield. So this kind of does everything you want to be doing in a life gain deck, right? You want steady sources of mana efficient life gain triggers, and that's what Case of the Uneaten Feast does immediately. You're going to be gaining at least 5 or more life on a single turn if you're in a properly built life gain deck. So solving this case is very trivial. And then what's better to survive or come back from a board wipe that inevitably comes than cracking this case and then just casting all the creatures that are currently in your graveyard for no mana investment too. Like you don't have to pay mana to sacrifice it or whatever. As soon as the case is solved, you can sacrifice it for 0 mana and then play all your creatures or whatever too. And it's just so good. It's just so much value. So basically, I would put Case of the Uneaten Feast in any life gain deck. Shauna decks, Bilbo decks, it doesn't really matter. If you're in a life gain deck that happens to run a bunch of creatures, then Case of the Uneaten Feast is going to be fantastic. We come to another narrow card that ends up being one of the best cards in the 99 of its respective deck. It is Metastatic Evangel. This is a 2 mana white creature Phyrexian Human Cleric. It's a 3/1 that says whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, proliferate. So the Evangel requires two things out of your deck. First, you want to be a creature-heavy deck to trigger its ability proliferating as much as possible, and you want to do something to do with counters. Usually that means +1/+1 counters, but not necessarily always the case. So for example, if you're in a +1/+1 counter deck and you're creature-heavy, then Metastatic Evangel is obviously a slam dunk there too. But if you're running any sort of other counter-style deck that runs a bunch of creatures, like an Infect deck, for example, a poison counter deck, then you pair up Ichor with the Metastatic Evangel, and you're just having a wild time with it. So yeah, the Evangel, as long as you deal with counters and you run a decent amount of creatures, I would say like 15 or more creatures in your deck, I think the Evangel's already worth it. And obviously, if you're running like 30 or more creatures in your deck, then it becomes insanely powerful. Then we've got a very sweet new flexible removal spell for +1/+1 counter decks. My current philosophy for removal in Commander is that I would ideally want the removal spells to further my own game plan. And Requisition Raid definitely does that for you if you are in a +1/+1 counter deck. So what it does is a white sorcery with Spree, so you can pay 1 additional mana to add on these additional abilities. You have to choose at least one of them. So it's always at least 2 mana, sometimes 3 or sometimes 4 mana. The first Spree ability, destroy target artifact. The other one, destroy target enchantments. And finally, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature target player controls. So if you're in a +1/+1 counter deck, Requisitioning Raid already furthers your own game plan, right? The final ability allows you to put +1/+1 counters very efficiently on all your creatures. And then if you're in a +1/+1 counter deck, that does a lot for you. Like Cadmia Whisper Hopes and Conclave Mentor both make it that you're putting 2 counters instead of just 1 on all your creatures. But then also they give you further upgrades too, like Cadmia Whisper Hopes has for even more mana, and the Mentor dies and gains even more life. But then beyond that, you're also having a disenchant effect tied to it too. So in this archetype, Requisition Raid is basically never a dead draw in your hand. It's either furthering your game plan or being a much needed spot removal spell when you need to just deal with a massive threat. And it also can do both at the same time. So it furthers your game plan, but also deals with things like you could lose the game to, and it does both at the same time. It is just great. So again, any style of +1/+1 counter deck, I think Requisition Raid is just a really easy shoe-in. Next, we move to Enchantress with another card I would deem an auto-include in that archetype, and that is Ghostly Dancers. This is a 5 mana, 2/5 creature spirit as flying, and when it enters, return an enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand or unlock a locked door of a room you control. And it has Eerie. Whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, create a 3/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So Ghostly Dancer is basically 2 cards smushed together. It's like an Auramancer because it ETBs, returns an enchantment back to your hand, and then it also produces creature tokens whenever you're playing your enchantments. So if you compare it to similar cards, Archon of Sun's Grace and Hallowed Haunting are also the same thing, where whenever you're playing enchantments, you make a bunch of tokens on the battlefield. Ghostly Dancers does that too. This one costs 5 mana instead of 4, but you got to keep in mind that it also comes with an ETB Auramancer effect, where you're returning an enchantment from your graveyard to your hand, and that's definitely worth the extra mana. So I think this is a slam dunk in basically any Enchantress deck. You could be Sithis Harvest Hand, dirtling around doing whatever, or you could be a Shrine deck, dealing with enchantments that way and dirtling around doing whatever. Ghostly Dancers and like the other token generators are just going to provide a board presence for you. So early to mid game, you have a good amount of blockers, and then late game, it just becomes your win condition, right? You have a critical mass of 3/1 flyers, and then you swing in for the win. Speaking of Enchantress, we've got our first room that I'm going to be talking about, and this one is upside down for me or sideways for me, but I'm going to fix it in post so you can read it normally, but I'm going to have to tilt my head like a weirdo. So this is an enchantment room. 2 sides. The first side is Dazzling Theater, the left side. It's a 4 mana white enchantment that says creature spells you cast have Convoke. And then the right room is Prop Room. It's a 3 mana white enchantment that says untap each creature you control during each other player's untap steps. So the bulk of the value of this card is definitely Dazzling Theater. If you are in any style of creature heavy deck, being able to just tap all your creatures to cast your other creatures creature spells is just super powerful, right? Like, especially if you're making like tokens, like you're in a Torrens deck or whatever. You're playing a bunch of creature spells and then you make a bunch of creature tokens as you're doing it passively. And then you can immediately tap those tokens to cast even more creature spells. And then if you have any sort of like card draw engine on the battlefield, like a Beast Whisperer type thing, you're just like comboing off, playing a bunch of creatures and then tapping those creatures to cast more creatures, draw more cards, and just keep going and vomiting out your entire library onto the battlefield, I guess. But then Prop Room is also really good too, because if you're tapping all your creatures to convoke out spells, you still want to have them as blockers or attackers, so Prop Room can just untap them for you as well. And then you could be even more fancy if you add in flash effects and you start, convoking out creature spells on your opponent's turns too. So for example, flash spells like Enduring Curiosity get a lot better when you have both Dazzling Theater and Prop Room on the battlefield, because you can convoke them out on your opponent's turn too. So you can tap out and cast all your spells, convoke all your spells on your turn, untap all your creatures, and then continue to convoke stuff on your opponent's turn too. Same thing with High Face Trickster. You can turn all your creature spells into spells with flash, so you can really take advantage of this room. But even if you're not going that crazy with all of its abilities and adding flash and whatnot, this card is just fantastic. So like cards like Balin the Haymaker is a fantastic home for it. Obviously, it's also you're doing creature convoking, so Kazla, the Convoke deck, is going to love this too. Apparently, enchantments got a lot of love this year in the budget section, because we got another one. Pearl Ear Imperial Advisor is a 3-mana white legendary creature fox advisor. It's a 3/4 with lifelink, and enchantment spells you cast have affinity for auras. And whenever you cast an aura spell that targets a modified permanent you control, you draw a card. So Pearl Ear is a fantastic inclusion in any aura style deck. It gives you a massive mana discount for all your enchantment spells if you're an aura heavy deck. And then on top of that, if you're loading up auras all on the same permanents, you're going to be drawing a bunch of cards too. So it makes it a fantastic choice in a Voltron deck or as being a Voltron commander. Pearl Ear is definitely fantastic as a Voltron commander by itself, but I think it's even stronger in the 99 of other more established Aura Voltron commanders. Like Light Paws, I think Pearl Ear was actually made in response to Light Paws being absolutely busted. I feel like Pearl Ear is what it should have been, honestly. It does card advantage and mana advantage, but just Light Paws does it like 10 times better and just an even lower mana discount, which is absolutely insane to me. I feel like that was a huge mistake, but whatever. But Pearl Ear, I would just jam it into the 99, no problem. And then same thing with other established Aura Voltron commanders like Uriel the Miststalker. You just jam Pearl Ear into an Uriel deck. You give a big mana discount to Uriel's aura spells that are being attached to it. And then also you're drawing cards too, because you're loading everything up on Uriel. All right, and then the 10th card is a Dark Horse candidate. I feel like a lot of people are sleeping on this card. However, it does have its own unique downsides, and I'll get to that soon. But this card is Charitable Levy. It's a 2-mana white enchantment that says non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. And whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, put a collection counter on Charitable Levy. Then if there are 3 or more collection counters on it, sacrifice it. If you do, draw a card. Then you may search your library for a Plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and shuffle. So Charitable Levy is a stacks card. It's a light stacks card, but it is a stacks card. It's very comparable to Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. It's the same mana cost, same effect, same stacks effect, except Charitable Levy is an enchantment, Thalia is a creature, and then Charitable Levy actually goes away by itself after 3 people cast a non-creature spell, essentially. It sacrifices itself, draws you a card, and puts a Plains onto the battlefield. So I actually think Charitable Levy it fulfills the same role as Thalia, but I think Levy is actually much stronger than Thalia in commander games. And my reasoning behind this is I think Thalia is basically going to last about as long as the Levy will last on the battlefield, because I feel like Thalia as a 2/1 creature is just going to last maybe 2 turns on the battlefield in a commander game. Like it's going to incidentally eat a board wipe, or something's going to ping it and it's going to die. There's just too many things that are going to just incidentally casually kill Thalia in a commander game. Whereas the Levy, yes, it also sacrifices itself after 3 spells, but I feel feel that's about the same amount of staxing you're going to be getting out of Thalia anyway. And the difference is that Levy is going to cantrip, it's going to draw you a card, so it's going to refund you itself a card, and it's going to ramp you out of planes, right? It's not even a basic planes. It can get you a dual planes or a triome or whatever. So I feel like Charitable Levy does the same thing as Thalia, has roughly the same effect as Thalia on the actual game state, but the difference is that the Levy, once it's gone, will actually refund you a card and ramp you up ahead, whereas when Thalia dies, you get nothing. So your results may vary, but that's how I see it. And then in terms of what decks you should be running it in, obviously you need to be in a very creature heavy deck to take full value out of the Levy. It is a symmetrical effect, so the only way to make it asymmetrical and only affect your opponents is to run a deck that is super heavy on actual creatures. So something like Samewise Gamgee, or if you just want to be a total troll and you don't care about taxing yourself, you can run just a Grand Arbiter or Gustin deck. You're already the arch enemy. You might as well throw in more tax effects into it. The only downside for the Levy, even though I think it is very powerful, is your results may vary. Like in Commander Clash, I played this card and I found out that like Seth found this card to be incredibly salt-inducing. Even though it did basically nothing to his overall game plan, like he had Cabal Coffers, he had like 18 mana out, he was eye-rolling me, and he saw me as enemy number one because I dared tax him a little bit on his 18 mana with Urborg and Cabal Coffers out. So yeah, that might be the results you get in your own playgroup. I know my own playgroup wouldn't be as salty about this, but you know, it depends who you're playing with. So sometimes the Levy is going to be a minor nuisance and it's going to get you a lot of value. And then sometimes your opponents are going to see it as like a huge Omega level threat, an Avengers level threat, and they're going to try and take you out over this card. And then it's not worth it in those cases. So it really depends on your playgroup, but I think this card is very powerful. All right, top 10 blue cards, and this is one of my favorite cards. I just love this one. This is Dreamtide Whale. It's a 3 mana blue 7/5 creature whale. It has Vanishing 2, and whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, proliferate. So this is another powerhouse proliferate engine in any deck that cares about any sort of counters, but it comes with 3 mana 7/5 body, which is very respectable. It's an amazing blocker, obviously, but it's also able to just smash people in the face for 7 damage, which is very respectable. It has Vanishing 2, but in my own experience, I've never seen the whale die to losing time counters on it. Because it's any player casting their second spell each turn, on your turn, as long as you're casting 2 spells each turn, you're proliferating. That means you're also putting a time counter on it, and you're also putting counters on all your other things too. And then whenever your opponents are playing their second spell, and usually they do that on their own turn, you're proliferating again. So what I've seen in terms of my experiences with Dreamtime Whale, in a single turn cycle in a 4-player game, I see it proliferating 2-3 times per turn cycle, just sitting there and just accruing value. You don't have to do anything else. You just have to cast spells, and your opponents have to cast spells, and then you're just like casually proliferating all the time, and it's so good. So just like Metastatic Evangel, if you're in a deck that isn't blue, that cares about counters, the whale is going to be fantastic. The difference here, though, is that Metastatic Evangel has to be in creature-heavy decks. The whale requires nothing out of you. All it requires is that you're casting 2 spells per turn on your turn, essentially, and that's pretty easy to do in any well-constructed deck. That's hopefully what you should be doing mid to late game every single turn, and then it just expects your opponents to do the same thing too. So obviously it gets a little bit better in like a Bumbleflower deck where you're giving your opponents card draw to make sure that they always have 2 spells to cast each turn. And then it's also just really good in other blue decks like Mothman, that it cares about +1/+1 counters, but it also cares about red counters. So you're also proliferating the counters. You're proliferating all the counters. It's so good. I love Dreamtide Whale. It's so insanely strong. I love it. Next, we have another amazing engine, but this is a card draw engine for Blink decks. This is Dour Port Mage. It's a 2 mana 1/3 frog wizard, and it says whenever one or more other creatures you control leave the battlefield without dying, draw a card. And you can pay 2 mana, 1 and a blue, and tap it. Return another target creature you control to its owner's hand. So having creatures leave the battlefield without dying means one or two things. Either it's bouncing back to your hand, which is what Dour Port Mage even does with its own abilities. so you can force the card draw that way, or you're blinking it, right? So those are the two ways you're going to be triggering it very consistently. And there's a lot of ways of doing this, but the most efficient way of doing it obviously is in blink decks. So if you slam down a Displacer Kitten, or you have Ephemerate effects, any deck that is running these type of blink abilities, the Dourport Mage is going to be saying, hey, whenever you're blinking, you also get to draw a card. Don't you like that? And I say, yes. Yes, I do like that. So any sort of blink commander like Brago King Eternal is going to absolutely love Dourport Mage. And then also anything that's like bounce-centric, like the new Frog Commander, Clement, the Worry Wards, is also going to get amazing value out of this too. You can also go like Ninjutsu as well if you really want to. It's just an insanely strong card draw engine at 2 mana. Next up, we have an enchantment that I feel is kind of overlooked. This is Nerd Rage. This is a 3 mana enchantment aura. This has enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, draw 2 cards. An enchanted creature you have no maximum hand size. And whenever this creature attacks, if you have 10 or more cards in hand, it gets +10/+10 until end of turn. So basically, the power floor of this card is it's a divination, right? You pay 3 mana, you draw 2 cards. Big whoop. Not that attractive. However, the main appeal of this card is that not just the card draw is happening, but it also turns one of your creatures into a random lethal game-winning threat. +7/+10 is nothing to sneeze at. Nerd Rage is also an aura, so if you put it in any sort of deck that cares about auras, like Arna, you can get amazing value out of it. Arna, if you put Nerd Rage on a creature and then you attack with it, then Arna will put another Nerd Rage copy of it onto that creature too, so you draw 4 cards for the price of 3 mana, and then, it has 2 abilities of +10/+10 until end of turn, so you can hit somebody for +20/+20, which is absolutely silly. And then any deck that cares about card draw, like Xyrus the Writhing Storm, you're going to be drawing oodles and oodles of cards of Xyrus. You definitely don't want to discard down to hand size. Nerd Rage deals with that, but also it basically means that +10/+10 is almost guaranteed to be on at any given time. Next, we have another really powerful card draw spell. It's Brain Surge. It's a 3 mana blue instant that says draw 4 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. So this is basically a throwback to Brainstorm. 1 mana, draw 3, put 2 back. This is 3 mana, draw 4, put 2 back. So you're up an extra card. It's essentially a instant speed 3 mana divination effect, which is on rate, but not super exciting these days. But Brain Surge, just like Brainstorm, is super exciting because of its top deck library manipulation shenanigans. Just like Brainstorm, this card works super well with like fetch lands, right? You draw 4, then you take 2 worst cards in your hand, put them into your library, crack a fetch land, shuffle your library, and then you draw something else that's much better. And also it plays very well with anything that is top of the library matters effects, like miracle spells, like Redress Fate. Like you put Redress Fate from your hand back on top of your library, you draw it later, and then you can cast it for its miracle cost of 4 mana instead of a whopping 8 mana. So Brain Surge, just like Brainstorm, is going to have a lot of powerful effects. Any deck that wants Brainstorm probably also just wants Brain Surge. It's just a second copy of it, essentially. Moving on, we got Emrakul's Messenger. This is a 2 mana, 2/1 creature Eldrazi Fairy Rogue. It has Devoid and Flying, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token, with sacrifice it, add 1 colorless mana. So Emrakul's Messenger doesn't look like much. It's only 25 cents, not a lot of people are hot on this card. However, it's an incredibly efficient Eldrazi spawn token engine. All it does is it requires you to draw 1 extra card on your turn, right? You have a card that you draw on the beginning of your turn during your draw phase, and then if you draw another extra card on your turn, you're making a creature token on all your turns. And then if you manage to draw 2 cards on an opponent's turn as well, that's the win more Christmas land, but it could potentially make more than 1 Eldrazi spawn creature token per turn cycle, which is very, very strong. Just getting 1 per turn cycle, I think, makes this card already worth running. But then if you could make multiples per turn cycle, it's just so much value. So decks that are going to really love it are the ones that can trigger it more than once per turn cycle. Zimodin Dina, is just geared around drawing 2 cards on each person's turn. So that's a lot of creature tokens. And then they're also sacrifice fodder for someone in Dina 2. And then also Minwily Illusionist, same thing. It's all about drawing your second card each turn. So these type of decks that are built around drawing 2 cards on everybody's turn are going to love the Messenger, but honestly don't have to go that deep. As long as you're making 1 token per turn cycle, it's already well worth it. Next, we have a sweet new card for all those artifact token decks out there. This is Forensic Gadgeteer. It's a 3-mana blue creature, Vidalcan Artificer Detective. It's a 2/3, and it says whenever you cast an artifact spell, investigate, and activate abilities of artifacts you control cost 1 less to activate, this effect can't reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1 mana. So Gadgeteer, you plop this down, then you cast a bunch of artifact spells, and it poops out clue tokens for you, which is already very good. But then on top of that, suddenly your clue tokens, which usually costs 2 mana to draw a card, which is not a really good rate, suddenly they only cost 1 mana to draw a card, which is actually way better. So you could actually just use those clue tokens to draw cards, but things get way better once you start building around it, of course. Stuff like Thought Monitor, because you have a bunch of clue tokens on the battlefield and they're all artifacts, you could very easily cast this for 1 mana when you have a Gadgeteer and just a couple other artifact spells being cast. Academy Manufactory, obviously, it turns all those investigates into also foods and treasures, which is just bananas. It's so busted. So you're just doing artifact things, and basically any artifact deck that cares about going wide with artifacts, that cares about tokens in particular, is going to really like the Gadgeteer. So Urza, for example, suddenly all your clues tap for blue, which is insane. And like Tetsun too. You want to craft with 6 artifacts. Well, the Gadgeteer makes a bunch of artifact tokens for you to craft with. So it works really well there too. And then speaking about clues, we have an amazing new finisher for any style of clue deck. This is Tangle Trove Kelp. It's a 7-mana blue artifact creature clue plant. It's a 6/6 with Ward 2. And then at the beginning of each combat, other clues you control become 6/6 plant creatures in addition to their other types until end of turn. And you can also, because it is a clue plant, you can pay 2 mana, sacrifice it, draw a card. Not that much to say about this. If you are in a clue deck, this is the finisher for you. It's literally even a clue itself, which is amazing. It's also a creature, so it works particularly well with any clue deck that cares about, playing creatures, which is most of them, the best ones, obviously, like Lonis Cryptozoologist and Eloise. But even if you didn't have like extra creature synergy or whatever, it doesn't matter. If you're a clue deck and you have a bunch of clue tokens on the battlefield at any given time, turning them all to 6/6s with Tangle Trove Kelp is basically GG when you swing out and deal, upwards of 40 plus damage. The next cards are a 2-parter. They're basically fulfilling the same role, they just do it a little bit differently. So Amphibian Downpour and Unable to Scream. Both of these are auras that basically turn the affected creature into basically nothing. They're just stuff that's sitting around doing nothing. So Amphibian Downpour, 3 mana enchantment aura with Flash and Storm. An enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a blue frog creature with base power and toughness 1/1. Unable to Scream is just 1 mana enchanted creature loses all abilities, and a toy artifact creature with base power and toughness 0/2 in addition to its other types. And then as long as the enchanted creature is face down, it can't be turned face up. So Amphibian Downpour costs 2 more mana, but the upside is it has Flash and it has Storm. So if other people are casting spells or you're casting spells, if spells have been cast this turn, you get extra copies of it for free. And it turns those affected creatures, those enchanted creatures, into 1/1s. Unable to Scream just costs 1 mana though. It turns into a 0/2, but you don't have Flash and you don't have Storm. Those are the major differences here. In my opinion, these enchantments are top level removal in Commander. And the reason why is because they're very, very good at shutting down opposing commanders. In this format, most decks are actually built around the commander. Like if the commander's not on the battlefield, the deck is not functioning very well. It's probably functioning at like 50% power. And then sometimes a lot of decks even are all in on their commander and they just effectively don't work at all if the commander's not on the battlefield. So being able to remove that commander as efficiently as possible is going to be incredibly effective at increasing your win percentage and making sure your opponents don't have a chance to stop you or, kill you before you kill them. And the reason why these enchantments are so good is as opposed to a removal spell, traditional removal spell like Swords of Plowshares or whatever, you remove the commander, it goes back to the command zone, and then they recast it later on. It's still very effective at slowing down the deck, but once that commander is back on the battlefield, the deck is running as usual. Whereas with the Downpour and Unable to Scream and similar effects, you enchant your opponent's commander, and the commander doesn't go back to the command zone yet. It can't be recast and then the deck keeps functioning. No, instead, they have to have a way to remove that enchantment. Usually the most easiest way of doing that is actually waiting around until someone wipes the board or the creature dies somehow, and then they are able to recast their commander too. But that takes a long time, right? Like either they find a disenchant or they find a way to kill their own commander, which can take a much longer time than just recasting it from the command zone when it gets swordsed or whatever. So these cards are just low-key, really, really powerful. The Downpour, so obviously these cards are especially good in Enchantress style decks because you get additional synergies with the fact that they're auras. So Entity Tracker, you draw cards. Ghostly Dancers, you make a 3/1. Sanctum Weaver, you tap for even more mana. So basically, if you're an Enchantress, I would highly, highly recommend running Unable to Scream and Amphibian Downpour. They're just top tier removal spells, and then they also have additional synergies. Next, we have Arcane Heist, and this is a card that I feel not a lot of people are talking about, but I absolutely love this effect. I love Cypher in general. So this is a 4 mana blue sorcery that says you may cast target instant or sorcery card from an opponent's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that spell will be put into their graveyard, exile it instead. And then Cypher is an old mechanic that they barely use. It says you may exile the spell card encoded on a creature you control. Whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player, its control may cast a copy of the encoded card without paying its mana cost. So you cast the spell, immediately get its effect, and then you get to encode the spell onto a creature, and whenever that creature hits an opponent, you get to cast a copy, the encoded spell, again for free. So Arcane Heist, I think, is particularly powerful. Cypher in general is particularly powerful in any Spellslinger deck that cares about you casting or copying spells, because Arcane Heist is multiple triggers of this in a single card, right? Arcane Heist, the first time you cast it, you're going to be triggering your Young Pyromancer and Stormkiln Artist. But then whenever you're triggering its Cypher ability, you're triggering the Pyromancer and Stormkiln Artist again and again and again. So like, if you cast Arcane Heist, you could trigger your Young Pyromancer 4 times in a single turn, the turn you cast it. You cast Arcane Heist, you cast an instant sorcery card from your opponent's graveyard, so that's 2 triggers already. You encode it onto an Evasive Beater, you hit somebody, and then you cast it again, and that's 2 more triggers. So that's 4 triggers the turn you cast it in Christmas Land or whatever. But I mean, that's the potential of Arcane Heist and Cypher in general. It's really, really powerful in Spellslinger. So obviously, I think this card's really good in Spellslinger decks like Veyran, but it can also be powerful in other sorts of decks too, like Felix 5 Boots, for example, which is all about combat triggered abilities. So those type of decks love Cypher too, because you get double the Cypher trigger as well. So really, really good stuff. I love these cards. I love Cypher. I want to see more of them. But Arcane Heist is definitely a new and very good one. All right, we move on to top 10 budget black cards. And this one is a staple, even ignoring the budget. This is a Cursed Marauder. It's a 2 mana black creature zombie warrior. It's a 2/1, and when it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a non-token creature. So the Cursed Marauder is the latest of the Marauder effects. We've had like 3 or 4 of them at this point, and they've all been considered like staples in like aristocrat strategies, like Fleshbag Marauders being the OG out of all of them, and they're all very playable. So it actually surprises me that they power crept all the previous Marauders so hard. Instead of being 3 mana, it's 2 for this effect, and it now skips over token creatures. So your opponents can't just sacrifice a random Eldrazi spawn token or whatever they have laying around. No, they have to actually sacrifice a creature that they spent mana on, which is so powerful. So it's just like, yeah, this is the best Marauder, and you still want to be running the older ones. The older ones are still amazing. The effect is still really, really powerful, but a Cursed Marauder is just the best out of the best now. So yeah, you're going to put the Marauder where you put the Fleshbag Marauders. So like zombie decks like Wilhelt, and anything that cares about, you know, sacrificing your creatures for value like Marin of Clan Top. The Cursed Marauder is just a slam dunk in all of them now. Next, we have a card that I feel is highly underrated, at least by some of the Clash crew. I know Krim is with me on this card's power. It's Flare of Malice. This is a 4-mana black instant that says you may sacrifice a non-token black creature rather than pay its spell's mana cost. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the greatest mana value among creatures and planeswalkers they control. So the Flares are a new cycle of free spells coming in Modern Horizons 3. All of them require you to sacrifice a non-token creature of the same color of the spell in order to not pay any mana for it. And they all have a really powerful effect. And I would argue Flare of Malice is actually the best out of the entire cycle, despite being one of the cheapest ones to actually pick up a copy of, because it's so easy to actually cast it for free, and the effect is so powerful. This type of removal spell effect is one of the strongest you can find in Commander, in my opinion, and still highly underrated. It's essentially just Soul Shatter. It's the exact same text, where Soul Shatter is 3 mana, Flare of Malice is 4, but it has the ability to cast it for free. Soul Shatter is somewhere between a spot removal spell and a one-sided board wipe, in my opinion. It affects each opponent, so you're 3-for-1ing your opponents with this ability, and it's killing oftentimes the most threatening creature on the battlefield, because chances are the creature with the highest mana value is the most threatening creature that you want to be killing anyway for each opponent's board state. So Soul Shatter, Flare of Malice, 9 times out of 10, they're getting maximum value out of all of your opponents, and they also circumvent hexproof, indestructible, all that annoying stuff that can stop you from actually killing and dealing with the threats. I also want to do a quick shout out to Make an Example. It's another one-sided board wipe. Yes, again, it doesn't kill all your opponent's creatures, but it kills always the most important creatures, and you can use it politically too. I think these type of effects are some of the strongest removal spells you can run in Commander, but Flare of Malice is extra powerful in sacrifice decks where you can actually utilize its free spell ability. The problem with most Flares is you actually don't want to be sacrificing your creatures. The only time you actually want to be sacrificing your creatures to cast Flares for free is if you're in a deck that wants to be sacrificing your creatures in general. And black happens to be the color of sacrifice. If you're in a sacrifice deck, chances are you're a black deck, right? You're black-based deck. So Braids or Risen Nightmare, you're obviously going to have tons of creatures that you want to be sacrificing to Braids' own ability. Might as well pitch one of those creatures to Flare of Malice and cast it for 0 mana. Yuriko's a unique case where it's not a sacrifice deck, but killing Yuriko is oftentimes the correct play, because then you can put it back in the command zone and Commander Ninjutsu it out off the back of another evasive creature to connect with Yuriko once more. So Flares are best utilized in sacrifice decks, therefore the black Flare effect is going to be the easiest to actually put into real decks and cast it for free, because black is the primary sacrifice color, and it has one of the strongest effects out of all the Flares too, which is why I think Flare of Malice is actually the strongest out of all the Flares. Next is a card that I entirely overlooked, but now have realized is incredibly powerful, and that's Chthonian Nightmare. It's a 2-mana black enchantment that says when it enters the battlefield, you get 3 energy counters, and then you can pay X energy, sacrifice a creature, return it to its owner's hand, return Chthonian Nightmare to its owner's hand, return target creature card with mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. So I completely overlooked this card because it deals with energy, and I was like, ugh, energy, and I just skipped over it. But realistically, this card is so strong in black sacrifice decks. If you pair Chthonian Nightmare in any black-based deck that has small creatures that act as fodder that you want to be sacrificing anyway, then this is just a really great way to continually reanimate those small creatures and just keep using its ability over and over again. So for example, if you have Primal Druid on the battlefield, you want to sacrifice it, might as well sacrifice it to Chthonian Nightmare and get back another small utility creature too. Same thing with like Shambling Gas. When it dies, you get to make a treasure. All is good in the world. You're running these cards anyway. Might as well just like start looping them together and keep getting value out of them. So yeah, if you're in a black-based sacrifice deck that focuses on small creatures, which is most of them, honestly, I think Chthonian Nightmare is going to be a fantastic recursion engine and also sack outlet for all these little creatures. So Alicia, who laughs at fate, is a brand new one that I absolutely love. Slimefoot and Squee is another great one. If you're black-based and you're focusing on small creatures, Chthonian Nightmare is going to do so much value for you. All right, black sacrifice decks are eating very well because we have another amazing new card to talk about, and that is 9 Lives Familiar. It's a 3 mana 1/1 creature cat. It says this creature enters with 8 revival counters on it if you cast it, and when it dies, if it had a revival counter on it, return to the battlefield with 1 fewer revival counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. So when we're talking about sacrifice fodder, obviously 9 Lives Familiar is one of the best new fodder spells out there because you can sacrifice it up to 9 times, aka 9 lives, which is very, very cute. Mechanically, it's amazing. And card design wise, it's also just really, really powerful. It fulfills a very similar role to other sacrifice fodder that returns itself, like Reassembling Skeleton. But the difference here is that Reassembling Skeleton requires you to pay 2 mana each time you're returning it from the graveyard to the battlefield, which starts to add up, right? Like, the 2 mana is not nothing. And if you're returning the skeleton over and over again over multiple turns, that's a lot of mana that you've sunk into the skeleton for its ability. Whereas 9 Lives Familiar, yes, it costs 1 more mana, and I guess you can't just mill it and then get it back from the graveyard that way. Whereas with 9 Lives Familiar, yes, it costs 1 more mana, but then you never have to spend another mana on it again. You're going to continually sacrifice it over and over again for no additional mana. Yes, it doesn't come back infinite times, it only comes back 8 times, but that's more than enough for a single sacrifice fodder card in the sacrifice deck, in my opinion. So yeah, compared to any sacrifice fodder that returns itself for mana, I'm always going to be picking the mana-free options like 9 Lives Familiar, so this is just an auto-include in sacrifice decks for me. Alright, there's no way around it. 2024 was the year of sacrifice effects in black. Just so many goodies for you to add to your decks. Vampire Goreman and High Society Hunter are just 2 more awesome draw engines for the sacrifice archetype. Vampire Goreman essentially works as a Phyrexian Arena in your sacrifice deck. It's a 2-drop. Every single turn it's going to be attacking, sacrificing a creature, drawing you a card, and then it's unblockable, so you hit somebody for 2, whatever. The point is that every single time you're attacking, you get to sacrifice something, so it's a repeatable sacrifice outlet, and then you get to draw a card. So it's a 2 mana Phyrexian Arena in your sacrifice deck. Really awesome. So High Society Hunter kind of works like the Gormans, where if you attack, you can sacrifice something, and then if it's a non-token creature, you get to draw a card. That's awesome. That's pressure in the air. It's hitting as a 6/4 on its first attack if you sacrifice another creature. That's great. But then whenever another non-token creature dies, either your creatures or anybody's creatures, you're drawing cards. So when you're sacrificing things, you're drawing cards along the way. When your opponents are losing creatures to anything, you're drawing even more cards along the way. If somebody wipes the board, you're drawing 8 or more cards on the way out. Like, this is insane card draw. This is so crazy. For just 5 mana, for an evasive beater as well. It's so good. It's so good. So yeah, if you're in a black sacrifice deck, 2024 was the year for you. You got so many goodies to play with, and they're so budget friendly too. Like, all these cards, like, they're under $1. It's insane. All right, we take a short break from black sacrifice decks to talk about a sweet new tutor. It's Lively Dirge. It's a 2 mana black sorcery with Spree, so you can pay +1, search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard, then shuffle, or +2, return up to 2 creature cards of total mana of 4 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So it's a 3 mana Entomb at sorcerer speed, not so great. 4 mana, return up to 2 creatures that are small from the graveyard to the battlefield. That's okay. And then 5 mana, you can tutor something and then immediately reanimate it, which is, pretty solid, actually. So the flexibility here is really nice. Lively Dirge, you can use its first ability, and you can just put something that you don't want to reanimate, like Wonder or Anger, into the graveyard from your library. That's always really good. And then you could also, tutor up and also just reanimate an insta-win combo. Like, you tutor up Warren Soul Trader or whatever, and then you reanimate Warren Soul Trader plus a Gravecrawler in your graveyard already, and then you just sacrifice the Gravecrawler infinite times and finish with like a Blood Artist effect to drain out your opponents. Like I said, this tutor, it's really flexible and really powerful. All right, we move to the first MDFC I want to talk about, which is Bogart Trawler. This is a 3 mana black creature goblin. It's a 3/1, and when it enters the battlefield, exile target player's graveyard. And then the backside is a land where it could enter the battlefield untapped if you pay 3 life, and it taps for black mana. So the Trawler is basically a Bojuka Bog, except it's an MDFC version of it. The Bog, it always enters the battlefield as a land and exiles something. swing, so you always get both effects essentially on the same side, but it always enters untapped. Whereas a Trawler, the land side can enter untapped. It doesn't exile anything, but it enters untapped, so you can actually use it for mana the turn you actually play it. And then the front side, it does have the exile ability. It's a 3/1, but it's not a land. I think both of these cards are just fantastic in basically any black deck, but the Bogart Trawler gets a little bit better in sacrifice decks, obviously. Moving on, we got a really good finisher for landfall decks. This is Iridescent Vine Lasher. It's 1 black mana for a creature Lizard Assassin. It's a 1/2 with Offspring 2, and it has landfall. Whenever a land you control enters, this creature deals 1 damage to target opponent. So if you're in a landfall deck, obviously you gotta find a way to end the game eventually, and amongst the Field of the Deads or whatever, you now have another way to indirectly kill your opponents outside of combat damage. So stuff like Lord Windgrace or the Necrobloom, any black-based landfall deck is going to really like Vine Lasher because, you know, you just play lands, you crack your fetches, you do all your lane shenanigans, and just as you're doing that, you're just pinging your opponents to death very slowly but surely, and I think that is very, very good. Okay, I have one more for you, and this is a dark horse candidate. This is Doomsday Excruciator. This is a 6-mana triple black 6/6 demon with flying, and when it enters, if it was cast, each player exiles all but the bottom 6 cards of their library face down, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card. So this card was making a very significant splash in Standard. Is really, really strong there. Basically, you play this card and then your opponents get milled out very quickly with Jace and you win the game. And I say, my friends, that it's just as easy to pull this little shenanigans off in Commander 2. I hate to say it, nobody tell Krim that I said this, but this is one of the best new finishers in any style of mill deck. So Captain Negathrod or, you know, Fennex got a mill. If you're in any sort of like 2-color, like black and something, or just mono black mill style deck, if you drop down an Excruciator and then immediately mill your opponents just a little bit, they're basically dead, right? Like they can't really do anything. They have to immediately win the game, or else they just deck themselves out and die. Or you could also be extra fancy, stuff like Rakdos the Muscle, for example. It's not a mill deck, but it does exile cards from people's libraries, and it exiles a significant chunk of them too. So you don't necessarily need to be mill. If you just run Rakdos the Muscle, you have it on the battlefield, and then you follow up with a Doomsday Excruciator, and then, you know, I don't know, like sacrifice it and deck somebody out. That's GG for that one player. And then you could just sacrifice some more creatures and then you win the game, essentially. So I think the Doomsday Excruciator is actually one of the strongest black cards printed in 2024, but it is very specific. You have to be like a mill-style deck or something like Rakdos where you can exile cards from your opponent's library. But in those homes, this card is a house. It's so strong. All right, top 10 budget red cards, and we start with probably the card that I've played the most that was printed in 2024. This is Sundering Eruption. So it's another MDFC. The front side is a spell. The back side is a land that taps for 1 mana, red in this case, and it can enter the battlefield untapped if you pay 3 life. So the spell sign, 3 mana sorcery, destroy target land. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. Creatures without flying can't block this turn. So we all know that non-basic lands are really, really strong in Commander, and they only get stronger over time. So you have to have answers to your opponent's threatening lands. And Sundering Eruption does that for you, right? There's a Field of the Dead that's annoying you, you blow it up. There's a Glacial Chasm that's annoying you, you blow it up. And by the way, on the turn you blow it up, guess what? All those zombies that were created with Field of the Dead, they can't block. You can swing in for lethal and kill them. It's great. So Sundering Eruption is basically the epitome of what I would look forward to when I'm choosing removal spells. These are removal spells that I want to further my game plan. And all the MDFCs do this, all the removal MDFCs do this in a very basic level where the backside is a land. So if I want to further my game plan and I'm missing a land drop, it's perfect that way. But on top of this, is Sundering Eruption is unique in that it's a removal spell that also is a finisher. So not only is a lane drop when I need it, not only does it remove threatening lanes when you need it, but it also removes blockers so you can actually end the game and swing in for lethal. So out of all the MDFCs we're going to be talking about, out of all the overpowered MDFC lands that we've seen in Modern Horizons 3, I would actually put Sundering Eruption at the very top. It's like basically that and Sink into Super are the top two for me. And I would say Sundering Eruption is the top one for me, honestly. It's a removal spell that furthers my game plan in multiple ways. It's so good. Speaking of good MDFCs, we got another one for you with Pinnacle Monk. So the backside again is a land that taps for red, enters the battlefield untapped if you pay 3 life. And the front side is a creature. It's a 5 mana red Jin Monk that's a 2/2 of prowess, and when it enters the battlefield, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. So basically, this card is an Archaeomancer. You're paying 1 extra mana for its effect because it can always be a land at any given time. It also has prowess. I don't think that's super relevant. It could be relevant in like a spell slinger deck or whatever, like Varen, you double the prowess triggers on it or whatever. But for the most part, you're just using it for its effect, and that's all you really need to use it for. The fact that it's a land and then late game, it could just return an important instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand is just fantastic. Like, okay, it's 5 mana. That's a lot of mana for a regrowth effect. But once you're in the late game, who cares? If you really need an instant or sorcery and it's going to win you the game, might as well just run this, right? And it's also a body that can start attacking too. So I would put it in, it's obviously best in spell slinger decks, right? Because you're going to have the most ways of triggering prowess. You're going to have the most instant and sorceries to choose from your graveyard. But basically any red deck that has like, you know, like 10 or so combined instant or sorceries in your deck, late game Pinnacle Monk, you know, even if there's one instant or sorcery in your graveyard as a target, as a valid target for it, that's enough to get good value out of it, right? Like, it's just a good recursion card that has a very low opportunity cost because it can always be played as a land that enters the battlefield untapped and taps for colored mana. So while I don't put it at the same tier as Sundering Eruption, this card is also fantastic and ends up being played in most of my red decks. All right, we move to another red card that I absolutely love and I jam into so many of my decks. That is Return the Favor. It's another spree card. This is double red instant spree, +1 copy target instant spell, sorcery spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. You may choose new targets for the copy, and +1 change the target of target spell or ability with a single target. So this card is just highly flexible. I primarily use it for its redirect ability, the second ability, where if I have a very important creature that I need not to die, like my commander, for example, if I really need my commander to be protected, I'm going to keep up 3 mana for Return the Favor and just redirect the Source of Plowshares or whatever as a red way of protecting my creature, my commander. But the fact that it can also be used as a reverberate, a fork effect too, makes it incredibly potent. So it's like half deflecting swat, half reverberate, super flexible that way. Essentially, if you're paying both the spree costs, you're getting wild ricochet out of it. And generally speaking, I don't care about, you know, paying all 4 mana, but both of these abilities are really good. Sometimes you will also just be able to pay 4 mana and get maximum value that way too. It's currently $2, which makes it a little bit cheaper to another card that I'm jamming in a whole bunch of my decks, which is Untimely Malfunction. Again, I'm primarily using Return the Favor and Untimely Malfunction as ways of redirecting things to protect my creature, my commander. But then having extra flexibility on top of that is just super good. So in the case of Return the Favor, it also doubles as a fork ability. And in the case of Untimely Malfunction, it can remove blockers, it can blow up pesky artifacts, and it costs less for its effect. Both these cards are super, super strong. Obviously, Untimely Malfunction is a little bit too expensive to show up on this list, just by a little bit. Whereas Return the Favor is more in the budget range for this video. But honestly, both these cards are so good. Next, we got another really underrated card. This is Rose Cutthroat Raider. This is a 4 mana 3/2 legendary artifact creature robot. It's a first striker with rain. At the end of combat on your turn, if you attack this turn, create a junk token for each opponent you attacked. And whenever you sacrifice a junk, add a red mana. So junk is a mechanic that just showed up with the Fallout Commander precons. They didn't show up anywhere else. It's an artifact where you can tap it, sacrifice this artifact, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn, activate only as a sorcery. It's essentially just as strong as treasures. It's basically the card draw equivalent of treasures, where you don't have to pay any mana for it. You draw a card immediately by tapping and sacrificing it. But you can only use that card that turn, right? Just like treasures, you can only use that mana that turn. But it's just so mana efficient to actually activate it, right? You don't have to pay 2 mana to draw a card or whatever for clues. You can just pay 0 mana, and then you get an extra card to work with that turn. And then whenever you sacrifice in junk, you literally get red mana to utilize on the cards that you're drawing or whatever. So that's super powerful, and you can make up to 3 junk tokens per combat if you have 3 opponents and you successfully attack 3 of them. So it's just a lot of value, a lot of card advantage and mana advantage rolled into one. It's very similar to Professional Facebreaker, where you're attacking opponents, you get to make treasures, and you can sacrifice those treasures to draw cards instead. The difference here is Rose Cutthroat Raider costs 1 more mana. However, you don't actually need to deal combat damage to your opponents. You just need to attack them. And you're not choosing between card draw and ramp. You're getting both of Rose. You sacrifice a junk, you draw a card, but you also get 1 mana as well. So I think, honestly, both of these two are on the same level. I think if you like Professional Facebreaker, you should be running Rose. And honestly, Rose is also really good in the command zone too. Like why not? As mono red card draw and ramp. Like that's really good to have. But you can also put her in the 99 of a bunch of decks. Obviously, anything that cares about exiling matters, like Rocco, Street Chef, and Prosper Tomebound. This is a slam dunk, right? Like, it's a really efficient exile mattering card advantage engine that also ramps you a little bit. Both things are things that Rocco and Prosper both really care about. As long as you have attackers, right? Like if you're a Prosper deck that has no way of actually attacking your opponents, then it's not very good. But obviously, if you have like just some fodder that you can attack with or whatever, then Rose gets really, really powerful. Then we've got a silly little common, Molten Gatekeeper. This is a 3 mana red artifact creature golem. It's a 2/3, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Molten Gatekeeper deals 1 damage to each opponent, and it has an earth of just 1 red mana. So if it's in your graveyard, you can pay 1 red mana to just put it from the graveyard directly onto the battlefield. It has haste, and it gets exiled at end step. So you have it basically for just 1 turn. So this is essentially just another Impact Tremors. It costs 1 more mana, and it's on a creature, so it's more vulnerable. However, the very notable thing is that you could just play from the graveyard, right? Like if you mill this into the graveyard, you could just unearth it and then immediately combo off and win. And also, notably, like if you're playing 1 Impact Tremors, chances are you want to run all of them. So a slightly worse Impact Tremors that you just hardcast for 3 mana and have it sitting around. It's fine. I mean, that's what your deck wants to be doing anyway. So having just more copies of it, even if slightly different, is always just super welcome. So obviously the decks that want to run this the most, something like a Gryson Starn Kellamorph, instead of dealing 1 damage to each of your opponents, you're doing 3. And then like Perforos God of the Forge, just is even better than Impact Tremors because it's a creature. So it enters the battlefield, Perforos does 2 damage to each opponent. And then whenever you're playing subsequent creatures, Molten Gatekeeper is pinging everybody for 1, Perforos is pinging everybody for 2. Your opponents die very, very quickly is what I'm saying. Speaking of pingers, we got Coruscation Mage for non-creature decks, mostly Spellslinger decks. So it's a 2 mana red otter wizard. It's a 2/2 of Offspring 2, so you can get a token copy of it for an additional 2 mana. And then whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. So much like the Molten Gatekeeper, if you're in a ping deck that is non-creature heavy, then this card is really good. Molten Gatekeeper is for creature decks. Coruscation Mage is for non-creature decks, but similarly, they're just like fantastic in their respective homes. It's essentially a Kessig Flame Breather, which is a card that you're going to be running in all your non-creature heavy pingy style decks. But this one is just like straight up better because it has Offspring. So if you have 2 extra mana laying around, you can have a second copy of the Mage, and instead of pinging your opponents for just 1 mana each, 1 damage each, you're pinging them for 2 each and 2 separate triggers, which is also very noteworthy for stuff like Garson and similar abilities. So if you're in a deck that likes the Flame Breather, the mage is just even better. So like Ob Nixilis, Captain Kingpin, pinging people for exactly 1 is super, super important. Nimizid Visionary, same thing, where you just ping somebody with the mage, one per opponent, and you draw 3 cards each time you trigger the mage. And if you have 2 on the battlefield, thanks to Offspring, you're drawing 6. Like that's insane. That's so good. So yeah, this card is so cracked. It's so good in ping decks. This is another narrow one, but also just absolutely cracked in the right deck. It's Crime Novelist, 3 mana red creature goblin bard. It's a 1/3. Whenever you sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on Crime Novelist and add a red. So if you're in an artifact deck that's regularly sacrificing your artifacts for value, Crime Novelist is just this huge mana engine for you that also grows into a serious threat later on. But most likely, you're going to be running it in treasure-style decks. So like Prosper Tombbound, you're sacrificing your treasures to make mana. Now Crime Novelist is adding an additional red to all those treasures. Same thing with like Jane Jensen, Chaos Crafter. This is even better than Prosper. It makes a bunch of treasure tokens, just like Prosper, which is great with the Crime Novelist. But then also you're sacrificing other artifacts for value too, which the Novelist gets even better and better. So yeah, in the right deck, if you're sacrificing artifacts very regularly, the Novelist is just generating so much mana for you and is becoming a lethal threat over time. All right, and then we've got a card that I think is super slept on. This is for all my fellow equipment lovers. This is Blacksmith's Talent. It's a 1 red enchantment class. So level 1, when it enters, you make a artifact token named Sword. It just gets +1/+1 and equip 2, whatever. Then on level 2, things get really spicy. So you pay 3 more mana, and then at the beginning of your turn, attach target equipment you control up to 1 target creature you control. That's already really good because some equipments cost a lot of mana to equip, and just bypassing that once per turn is really good. It's a huge ramp option for equipment decks. And then finally, level 3, once you get there, your equipped creatures have double strike and haste, which is just beautiful keywords. Beautiful keywords for an aggressive style deck, especially if you're running like the Swords of X and Y. Double strike means double the triggers and double the fun. So yeah, the decks you want to be running it in, obviously equipment decks. The best equipments that you're going to be utilizing with it, Colossus Hammer, level 2. Instead of paying 8 mana to equip the hammer to something, you pay 0. That's pretty nice. Same thing with like Sunforge. Equip 3 is pretty hefty. Might as well just equip it for free. So these type of the cards are going to be just game winners with Blacksmith's Talent out. And then the type of decks you have as leaders for Captain America, First Avenger, Nahiri, Fortune Fury, just any equipment commander, essentially. Just run Blacksmith's Talent. It's going to be so good. Here's a card that I actually overlooked a lot. This is Magda the Horde Master. It's a 2 mana legendary creature dwarf berserker. It's a 2/2, and it says whenever you commit a crime, create a tapped treasure token. This ability triggers only once each turn. And sacrifice 3 treasures, create a 4/4 red scorpion dragon creature token with flying and haste, activate only as a sorcery. I looked at this Magda, and it seemed like a much weaker version of the original Magda. And in some ways it is, but in some other ways it's actually much easier to get tons of value out of this. Like for example, if you are in a deck that can commit crimes very easily and efficiently on not just your own turn, but your opponent's turns as well, this is going to make oodles of treasure for you. So Rocco Street's Chef is another one that just does this very efficiently. On each person's turn, if they're playing or casting the spell that Rocco exiles for them on their own turn, then you can choose to put the +1/+1 counter from Rocco, not on your creature, but on one of your opponent's creatures, and that will commit a crime, and that will mean you get a treasure out of Magda. So in a single turn cycle with Rocco, if everybody's playing the card that's exiled with Rocco's ability, that's 4 treasures. 4 treasures per turn cycle, which is absolutely nonsense. And then obviously if you're in like a fully committed crime deck like Marchesa, Dealer of Death, obviously Magda is going to be super fantastic there. And then the fact that like if you have excess treasures and you don't have stuff to spend it on, or like you just need more of a board presence, you can start sacrificing them, put 4/4 flyers onto the battlefield. That's great too. Or I guess if you have just a horde of treasures, you just end the game. You sacrifice all your treasures, make an army of 4/4 flyers with haste, and then win the game that way too. All right, then we come across to one of the most played and hyped budget cards from 2024, which is Demand Answers. It's a 2-mana instant. As an additional cost to cast a spell, sacrifice an artifact or discard a card and draw 2 cards. This is essentially the slightly power-crept version of Thrill of Possibility. It does the same thing, except instead of discarding a card, you can sacrifice an artifact instead. I think in playtesting, these cards are essentially the same. Most decks that want to be running Thrill of Possibility want to be discarding a card, and it's the same thing you want to be doing with Demand Answers. However, Demand Answers is a little bit more flexible if you're in decks that have like artifact fodder that you actually want to be sacrificing or don't care about having them sacrificed. For example, if you're like a food deck or a clue deck or whatever, or you just have oodles of treasures on the battlefield, I guess, then you can sacrifice them to draw 2 cards at instant speed with Demand Answers. That's not terribly bad. In practice, I haven't found that to be like super exciting to me. So I just typically just run it in the same decks as Thrill of Possibility is. But that said, just having another copy of Thrill of Possibility is incredibly powerful in decks that liked it a lot, such as Kalamex of Stormsire, where when you're copying it, you don't have to pay the additional cost of discarding card. So if you have Kalamex tapped and you cast Demand Answer or like Thrill of Possibility or whatever, you discard a card, draw 2 cards, and then Kalamex just draws you 2 more cards extra on top of that. You don't have to discard again. And then some decks want you to discard cards for value. For example, Disa the Restless, you discard a Lurgoy from your hand, and then Disa just puts it immediately onto the battlefield at instant speed. That's super good. So Demand Answers, to me, it's just another Thrill of Possibility. Like the decks that want to be or are in a position to sacrifice artifacts, I feel like you have better outlets to sacrifice your artifacts anyway, so I don't necessarily want to add it there. But if you are in decks that just want more Thrill of Possibilities, this card is just another one of those, and it's very good. There were a lot of really good budget cards in red, so just a quick shout out to Flare of Duplication. If you happen to be in a red sacrifice deck that you actually want to be sacrificing your red creatures, this one's really, really good. Grim Reaper's Sprint is like fantastic. It's a 2-mana extra turn spell. If you manage to kill something very consistently on your turn as you're going for your second combat. And Party Thrasher is also like fantastic in like Prosper decks or whatever. Any Exile Matters, it's more non-creature heavy than creature heavy. This is going to be super, super good there. All right, top 10 green cards. And we start with another card I would consider borderline staple in like all of my personal green decks, at least. It's Bridgeworks Battle. So the front side sorcery is 3 green. Target creature you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn. It fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. And on the backside, as always, is a land that taps for green, and it can enter the battlefield untapped if you pay 3 life. So as I've said before, I highly value removal that furthers my game plan. All the MDCs do that because if I'm missing a land drop, I can always just play this as my land for the turn. But if I actually do need to kill a creature in a pinch, Bridgeworks Battle, the front side does that very well. And yes, it does it at sorcery speed. However, the opportunity cost here is very low, and it even grows my creature too by +2/+2. So that means my smaller creature, like let's say I have a 3/3 on the battlefield and I want to kill a 4/4, I can grow my creature larger than that and then fight that creature successfully and then immediately smash in for an extra 2 damage. So I just think these type of cards, all these MDFCs, if they have a good effect on the front side and they tap for colored mana and can enter the field untapped if needed as a land on the other side, if the effect is good on the front and it's well costed, I'm just jamming it. I'm just jamming into like all my decks. I'm not thinking too hard about it. I'm also heavily on Team Kalni Ambush, by the way. I run this in basically all my green decks too, and it's an instant speed version of it, but it doesn't give the creature +2/+2. I still think Kalni Ambush's instant side is superior. However, the backside, it's a lane that always enters the battlefield tapped, as opposed to Bridgeworks Battle where you pay 3 life and it can enter untapped. So I think the battle is actually superior to the ambush for that reason. But I just run both. I run both in basically all my green decks now. All right, speaking of MDFCs, we got another one for you. Disciple of Freyalise. This is a 6-mana green elf druid creature. It's a 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, you gain X life and draw X cards, where X is that creature's power. The backside, It's a land, taps for green, enters the battlefield untapped for 3 life. Again, the effect is just really powerful. I would say it's less of an auto include than the fight spell, honestly, because you do need, larger creatures for this thing to be good, and you want them to be sacrificed. It's essentially Disciple of Bolas, right? It's a callback to that card. It does the exact same thing, but this one's just way better because, yes, it costs more mana, but the backside is a land when you need it to be, which is super, super important. Honestly, I jam Disciple of Freyalise in a bunch of decks without worrying about it too much, but it's going to be the strongest in Go Tall decks, right? Like Henzi, Toolbox, Tora, you're just cheating out huge creatures, or if you're like in Galta or whatever, anything that's like Go Tall, you're going to love it. And it's also really sweet in other type of decks too, like Atali Primal Conqueror, for example. A lot of the times you don't want to actually flip Atali and go smashing with it. You usually just want to play Atali, blink Atali, and then eventually like have it die and then recast Atali because the ETB trigger is so good. So Disciple of Freyalise in an Atali deck is another way of just like getting the ETB trigger from Atali, sacrificing Atali to refill your hand, restock your hand, and then puts you in a position to recast Atali later. So Disciple of Freyalise, very good. Obviously much better in Go Tall decks, but you could jam it in basically any green deck, and it's going to be pretty nice, honestly. Next, we have another card I'm super high on with Collective Resistance. It's a 2-mana green instant with Escalate. So you pay this cost for each mode chosen beyond the first. So you choose one or more, destroy targeted artifact, destroy targeted enchantment, or target creature gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So the reason why I would run Collective Resistance is if I'm in a deck that is very focused on my commander, like all in on my commander. If my commander's not on the battlefield, my deck isn't functioning properly. In those cases, I really, really highly value cards that can protect my commander from removal, right? I want it to stick around. I don't want it to die and then have to recast it for even more mana. That's going to put me too far behind. And Collective Resistance does that. It gives hexproof and indestructible until its turn for 2 mana. 2 mana is more than 1, and there's some cards that do this for 1 mana. However, it comes with the removal stapled onto it, and that's the big difference here. So yeah, compared to dedicated protection spells like Tamiyo Safekeeping, you're paying 2 mana instead of 1, which is double how much you want to be paying, but this comes with the flexibility of being artifact and enchantment removal at the same time. It could do both. They could do all 3 things at the same time if you really needed to, which is fantastic. And that's what I want out of my removal spells. Again, I want my removal spells to be able to further my game plan. So if I'm all in on my commander, the number 1 removal spell that I'm going to go for, honestly, is Collective Resistance. It's really that good. Okay, now we've got a card that is actually creeping up in money, and it's just barely making this video. It's Smuggler's Surprise. So it's another spree spell. Surprise. The spree spells are very good, actually. It's 1 green instant, and it has a spree of +2. Mill 4 cards. You may put up to 2 creature and or land cards from among the milled cards into your hand, +5, so 4 and a green. You may put up to 2 creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield, and +1, creatures you control with power 4 or greater gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So this card is an absolute blessing for any Go Tall style creature-based deck. For 2 mana, all your big stompy creatures have hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, like power 4 or greater, obviously. And that's like the main draw of this card. It's essentially a heroic intervention for your stompy decks. It only protects your stompy creatures. It doesn't help the rest of your battlefield or whatever, but their main core of your deck is safe for just 2 mana. And then on top of that, just gravy, right? The +2 ability, mill 4 cards. If you're a stompy deck and you're basically just creatures and lands, you're going to just draw 2 cards essentially for that ability. And then the +5 ability, you just get to channel in, ramp in 2 creatures from your hand onto the battlefield at instant speed. That's really good. You untap your lands and everything on your turn, and you immediately get to swing in for surprise value. All these modes are really, really good. The last mode is the most important to me, but everything else is just extra gravy on top. This is an auto include in like any sort of stompy deck, I would say. Like Galta Primal Hunger is one of my own personal decks. This is obviously one of the best cards that I'm adding from 2024. But then if you're just like in a random like dragon deck or your dinosaur deck or whatever, if you're like mostly creatures that are big, run Smuggler's Surprise. It's going to be really good for you. Then we've got another card that is just a house in +1/+1 counter decks. This is Evolution Witness. For 3 mana, green, you get a creature, elf, shaman, mutant. It's a 2/1. It has 2 mana, adapt 2. So if it has no +1/+1 counters on it, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. And then whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Evolution Witness, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is an Eternal Witness that has a much worse power floor, but a much higher power ceiling in a +1/+1 counter deck. At the start, it's absolute garbage, right? It's a 3 mana 2/1. That's not where you want to be. And then you have to pay 2 more mana to actually use this Eternal Witness effect and get something back from the graveyard. However, if you have other ways of just putting +1/+1 counters on the Witness, especially if you could do it more than once, however, once you have an efficient engine to put +1/+1 counters on the Witness, hopefully repeatedly, it just returns like all the permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand, essentially, for no mana down. It's a crazy good engine. So Wise Mothman, for example, is a great way of putting +1/+1 counters on the Witness. Miss Bumbleflower is probably the best of the best here. Whenever you're casting a spell, you get to just you get to put a +1/+1 counter on the Witness and get back another permanent from your graveyard to your hand. You just keep doing that over and over for each spell you cast. That's ridiculously good. So yeah, if you're in a +1/+1 counter deck, this is one of the best regression engines in the entire deck for you. It's so good. It's so powerful. Next, we come across another Flare. This is a Flare of Cultivation, the green one. It's a 3 mana green sorcery. You may sacrifice a non-token green creature rather than pay the spell's mana cost. Search your library for up to 2 basic lane cards. Reveal those cards, put one of them into the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, then shuffle. So this is a Cultivate, right? It's a slightly harder to cast Cultivate, but it's just a Cultivate. And Cultivate / Kodama's Reach or whatever, I think are still playable in Casual Commander. I still jam them from time to time. I'm running them less these days, but I still run them, and I don't think they're like power crept out of the format or something. They're still good effects. So Flare of Cultivation, just as its baseline, is the same mana cost as Cultivate, slightly harder to cast, but it's already a good spell to just hard cast. You're not going to feel totally bad about it. But then on the upside here is if you sacrifice a green creature, you get to Cultivate for free, which is where it starts getting absolutely ridiculous. So I said with the Black Flare that you really want to be in a sacrifice deck to utilize it properly. That's not actually the case with Flare of Cultivation. You don't necessarily need to be in a sacrifice deck to get good value out of it. You just need to have creatures, lots of creatures that have powerful enter the battlefield triggers, like Wood Elves, for example, or Eternal Witness. These are creatures that you're playing for its triggered ability. You don't actually care about the creature after it's done its job. Like after Wood Elf ramps, you don't really care about the 1/1 anymore. Eternal Witness, once it returns a card from your graveyard, you don't really care about the body anymore. So in these type of decks where you're heavy on creatures that have enter the battlefield triggers and you don't actually care about the body after they trigger their ability, Flare of Cultivation is just a free spell, right? Like you play Wood Elves on turn 3 or turn 2 or whatever, and you ramp out a lane, then you can immediately just sacrifice elf, Flare of Cultivation, ramp again, and put a land into your hand. It's absolutely insane. So Flare of Cultivation, I did say the black one was the easiest one to use properly. I actually think Flare of Cultivation is the easiest one to use properly. I take it back. I think Flare of Cultivation is the easiest one to use properly in multiple different types of green decks. The black one probably is it's the best one in Sacrifice, which is like the primary archetype for black. I think Flare of Cultivation, though, is probably like the easiest one to cast. I still think the black one has the strongest effect, but this one, I mean, free Cultivate is really, really good here. Obviously, it gets better in Sacrifice decks. So, like, if you have a Smeagol deck, you have a Eudora deck or whatever, sacrificing the creature is now a further upside. But you really don't need to do that to get a lot of value out of Flare Cultivation. You just need to have a lot of creatures with enter the battlefield triggers, and then you just sacrifice them afterwards. It's really, really that easy. Speaking of ramp and good Flare Cultivation targets, Clifftop Lookout is another new Wood Elves variant. It's 3 mana green creature Frog Scout. It's a 1/2 of reach, and when it enters, reveal the top cards from your library until you reveal a lane card. Put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is like a Wood Elves. It's like a Farhaven Elf. The downside here is you don't get to tutor up the land you want. You just get whatever's on top of your library. But the upside here is it can hit non-basic lands. So Farhaven Elf, you're stuck to basic lands. Wood Elves, you're stuck to forests. Clifftop Lookout, you could get whatever. Like, you don't have to run any forests or basics in your deck if you don't want to. This is like Seth's dream over here. But realistically for me, even if you're running basics, if you like Farhaven Elf, if you like Wood Elves, if you're running those already, this one is just an extra one to jam into your deck. Like, there's still room for more of them usually. And the body is actually quite nice too, because it has reach. So you could chump block a big beater in the air, like a big angel flying your way or whatever. You could save yourself some life by chump blocking with the Lookout. Next, we have another powerhouse card that is only 25 cents. Really? That's crazy. I thought casuals would love this one. Apparently not as much as I thought they would. Monstrous Vortex. It's a 4-mana green enchantment that says, whenever you cast a creature spell with power 5 or greater, discover X, where X is that spell's mana value. So whenever you're casting your big creature spells, boom, you get another free card on top of it. And you could either put directly onto the battlefield, so it's card advantage and mana advantage, or if you don't want to cast it, you could just keep it in your hand, so it's just card advantage. Either way, this is huge value for stompy decks everywhere. Then we've got a really good option for self-mill decks. This is Head Shredder. It's a 4-mana green artifact vehicle. It's a 5/5 when it's crewed, at least. And whenever it attacks, you mill 2 cards. And whenever one or more land cards are put into your graveyard from your library, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and has crew of just 1. So this card is just absolute bananas once you factor in some really efficient self-mill engines, because whenever you're milling your lands, you're putting them directly onto the battlefield. All of them. All of the lands you're milling go directly onto the battlefield. So like self-mill engines like Mesmeric Orb, for example, just go nuts with the Shredder. Abhorrent Oculus, which is Manifest. So you put 1 onto the battlefield and 1 into your graveyard. As long as you're putting those lands into your graveyard, you're just putting them directly onto the battlefield instead of a Shredder. This card goes so hard. It's such a crazy ramp engine in any self-mill deck. It really goes nuts. So it's a slam dunk in like the Necrobloom, obviously, because all your land cards have dredge too. So you're just dredging more lands into your graveyard, and then you put them directly onto the battlefield instead, or just like dedicated self-mill decks like Sidisi Brew Tyrants. All those lands you're self-milling with your zombies and stuff, they just go onto the battlefield instead, and it's super good. It's super strong. And then we've got a turtle for all you high toughness lovers out there. It's Fecund Greenshell. It's a 5-mana green creature elemental turtle. It's a 4/6 with reach. As long as you control 10 or more lands, creatures you control get +2/+2. And whenever it or another creature you control of toughness greater than its power enters, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped. Otherwise, put it into your hand. So worst case, when it or another big toughness creature enters, you're drawing a card. Best case, though, you're taking that card that you drew and you put it directly onto the battlefield instead if it's a land. That's really crazy. And then on top of that, not only is it like an amazing card advantage and mana advantage engine, but also once you've ramped out 10 or more lanes, thanks to the turtle or whatever, all your creatures now have +2/+2, which is just a nice little anthem right on top of everything, which is really good. So obviously you need to be in the right deck for this. You need to be in a deck that values toughness, like high toughness, low power. So like Pride of the Hulklade, obviously a shoe in here. Doran the Siege Tower, obviously a shoe in here. Arcades, the Defender deck, obviously a shoe in there. It fits in multiple different decks, but it's like very specific commanders. But if you can find the right home for it, it's like one of the best cards in the entire deck, like no question. Honestly, green has so many cards I could have talked about, way more than just 10. So just quickly going over them: Overprotect, Free Strider Lookout, Outcast Trailblazer, Tato Farmer. All of these cards are just so strong in their respective decks. And just quick shout out to all of them. But I really can't talk about all of them, or else this video will go on forever. But yeah, green had a really good year for 2024, I'd say. All right, top 10 budget multicolor cards. Surprise, it's going to be more MDFCs. So the multicolor MDFCs, all of them tap for 2 colors, but the land side, all of them enter the battlefield tapped. They don't have the option of entering untapped by paying 3 life. They tap for 2 different colors though, but they will always enter the battlefield tapped. So that's the upside and the drawback to them. So this one, the green black one, the front side is Revitalizing Repass. It has a hybrid cost of either green or black, and it's just 1 mana. For an instant that says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, it gains indestructible until end of turn. So this one I run a bunch too in my Golgari decks that care about my commander, really. If my deck is heavily reliant on my commander, I want to have really cheap, efficient ways of protecting my commander. Ideally, if they're flexible too, and repass checks that box, right? It furthers my game plan. It's delayed when I need it to be, but then sometimes I just keep it in my hand to protect from an inevitable board wipe or some removal spell or whatever. It's particularly good in like Skullbriar. I love it in Skullbriar because that +1/+1 counter kind of stays on Skullbriar forever, which I love. And then also the +1/+1 counter, you know, makes it a little bit better in like a Traxa or whatever. You put a +1/+1 counter on Traxa, and now you're getting 5 life per swing, and then you proliferate, and now you're going to gain 6 next turn. That's just really good. But yeah, this card is really gas. If you're in a any deck that cares about its commander a lot, it's just an easy way of adding additional protection for a lane slot. Then we've got Strength of the Harvest. This is the green-white one, where it's a 3-mana hybrid white or green enchantment aura. It says enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each creature and or enchantment you control. So this one I absolutely love in 2 style of decks. First, Enchantress, obviously. So like Sithis Harvest Hand. You dirtle a whole bunch, you know, you're just playing your enchantments, drawing cards, playing more enchantments, drawing more cards, ramping a whole bunch. Eventually you need to win the game somehow. And one of those ways is just like take your random creature, put Strength of the Harvest on it mid to late game, and it's swinging for like an additional 15 damage. That'll end the game pretty quick. And then also go wide decks like Torrent's Fist of the Angels. You're playing a bunch of creatures, which make more tokens. You're going to have like 10 or more creatures on the battlefield. Put Strength of the Harvest on one of them, and they get +7/+7, and just go out and have fun with it, right? So yeah, I really like Strength of the Harvest, where it's a lane drop early on, but late game, it could just be an extra bonus finisher that your opponents have to account for. The Orzhov MDFC is also really good, but I think is criminally underrated. This is Glasswing Grace. It's 5 mana, hybrid white-black, enchant aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has flying and lifelink. My current deck building philosophy is I want to ideally have at least one source of life gain, like burst life gain effect in all my commander decks. Something that can get me out of the red zone late game. You know those games where you're stuck at like 5 life, and you knew that if you could survive, I don't know, like a Kakusho dying and draining everybody for 5, if you could survive that somehow, you would win the game. Or like somebody's Blood Artist draining you. They're not going infinite or anything, but they're draining you. And if you were just like over 3 life or something like that, you would for sure win. But because you're stuck at 3 and you have no way of getting life, you're just like doomed to lose. Well, if you have a burst life gain effect like Glasswing Grace, that can pull you out of the red zone as a big surprise. You know, you have like a 3/3 on the battlefield or like a 5/5 on the battlefield. Suddenly slap on Glasswing Grace on it. It becomes like a 5/5 or a 7/7 with flying lifelink. You smack somebody for 5 or 7. That could win you the game by itself, but also the life gain can get you out of the red zone, and then suddenly you can win the game for just not dying, you know? So while Glasswing Grace looks pretty weak, kind of meh in terms of the rest of the MDCs that we saw, I feel like low-key it's one of the strongest because that burst lifelink is so important late game to get you out of the red zone. And then obviously it gets better in certain decks too, like Onyxia, for example. You slap this on Onyxia, and now suddenly you give her evasion, right? Like not just menace, but now it becomes like a 6/6 flyer, gains you a bunch of life in the process so you can keep attacking with her. And then also it gets better in like life gain decks like Karlov of the Ghost Council. Gaining life is actually important for Karlov, and then giving it evasion, it allows you to like start one-shotting people in the air, which is quite nice. But I don't think you actually need to build around it really. You just need to have some way of getting life in basically any deck. So if I'm in Orzhov these days, I just kind of just slap in Glasswing Grace as just like a way to gain life late game. Just an out to getting out of the red zone. Then we've got the Gruul MDFC. It's Stump Stomp. 2 mana sorcery. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. Again, spot removal that furthers my game plan. The backside, if I'm going to miss a land drop, boom, it's a land. Very happy with that. But if an opponent has a creature that is threatening to make me lose the game or they win the game, I can always remove it with Stump Stomp. So the flexibility here is really nice, and that's what I look forward to with all my removal spells these days. And then finally, for MDFCs, I promise this is the last one, Legion Leadership. This is the Boros one, 2 mana, instant that says until end of turn, double target creature's power and it gains first strike. So this is a finisher card, right? Like you go to attacks, you swing in with like a 10-10 or whatever. It's not enough to kill anybody, but then after blockers are declared, no blocks or whatever, boom, double its power. Now the person's dead. That's really sweet. But the sweetness also comes with the fact that you don't have to target your own creature. Let's say one of your opponents is swinging out at one of your other opponents, not for lethal or whatever. You could just double that creature's power and maybe it becomes lethal suddenly. And then you just killed one of your opponents while utilizing your opponent's creatures, like a mutual enemy is just taken out by a little tag team. It doesn't even have to be a willing tag team too, right? Like you could just do it after blockers declare surprise, that person's actually dead now. Oops. So I love this card. It's a very much a gotcha card. It does absolutely nothing until you actually try to win the game with it, but it does close out games very effectively. All right, away from MDFCs for a little bit, let's talk about Insidious Roots. It's a 2-mana Golgari instant that says creature tokens you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color, and whenever one or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 0/1 green plant creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. Basically, if you're making creature tokens and you're in Golgari, this is a really powerful mana engine, and it just has extra value on top of it with its second paragraph. But the main draw here is that it turns all your tokens into birds of paradise, essentially. So if you're going wide with tokens, this card is really good. So like Chatterfang, Squirrel General, for example, all of your squirrels suddenly tap to add mana of any color. That's super good. And then you can also utilize the other ability where creature cards are leaving your graveyard to make a bunch of plants and growing the plants. Like Tayam is one of the best ways of doing that. It's a 3-mana activated ability. Is really good with Insidious Roots. You return something, permanent card from, hopefully a creature from your graveyard back onto the battlefield, trigger Insidious Roots, make a plant, put +1/+1 counters on each of your plants, then you have more +1/+1 counters to feed into Tayam's activated ability, keep doing the loop over and over again. Really good stuff. And then we've got, hey, another Golgari card that I think is super good, Honest Rutsteen. It's a 3-mana Golgari legendary creature, human warlock. It's a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So this is a 2-parter here. It's an Eternal Witness for just creature cards. It can't get any type of card, but it can get creature cards. And then creature spells cost 1 less to cast. So it's both ramp and Eternal Witness in creature heavy decks, which is the combined value over here for just 3 mana is kind of bonkers. Ramp and recursion, very effective at both. The restriction here is not much of a restriction if you're in a creature heavy deck. It's just gravy either way. It's really good in any creature heavy deck. Like, so Gitrog, the Ravenous Ride, obviously, you're going to be very creature heavy, and then whatever you sacrifice to the Gitrog, you can return with a Rothstein, and then cast it for cheaper afterwards, sacrifice it again to the Gitrog. It's also a legendary creature, so that's actually notable for Jodah the Unifier. It doesn't make Jodah easier to cast, unless he already died and you're paying for the command tax or something like that, but it is a legendary creature. It does return creatures from the graveyard back to hand, and it will make your other legendary creature spells cheaper too. Guess what? We have more Golgari to talk about. It's White of the Reliquary. Yes, we still have more Golgari cards. It's a 2-mana Golgari creature zombie knight. It's a 2/2 of vigilance, and it gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard. And you can tap it, sacrifice another creature, search your library for a lane card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. This is another slam dunk in any sacrifice deck. If you have creatures you want to be sacrificing, this is one of the best ways of doing it, because at the very least it's ramping out a land, but better than that, it's ramping out a specific land card. So what are you doing with this? Obviously, lane style decks like Necrobloom. If you're lane falling, you're making a bunch of plant creature token fodder and then zombie creature token fodder. Obviously, White of the Reliquary is just absolutely nuts there. But then if you are also in any style of like Golgari sacrifice deck where you want to be sacrificing creatures on purpose for value, like Zamonandina, White's super fantastic there. It's especially good in Zamonandina, obviously, because you want to have 8 or more lands, and this land ramps you. But yeah, White of the Reliquary, any sacrifice deck, any lands mattering deck that happens to poop out, creature tokens or whatever while it's doing this landfall shenanigans, The White Reliquary is just so good. Okay, surprisingly, not another Golgari card, but we got a black-blue card, Satoru the Infiltrator. 2 mana Dimir, legendary creature, human ninja rogue. It's a 2/3 of menace, and when it and or one or more other non-token creatures enter the battlefield under your control, if none of them were cast or no mana was spent to cast them, draw a card. So how do you get creatures onto the battlefield without casting them? Well, there's a bunch of ways. First off, obviously, this is a reference to ninjutsu. It's a ninja itself. And whenever you're ninjutsuing in creatures, you're drawing cards. But obviously, it works very well with Displacer Kitten and Blink effects too. They get exiled and then return back onto the battlefield. You draw cards. If you're reanimating or whatever and not casting them from the graveyard, then you get to draw cards too. Also, if you're doing like Morph shenanigan or Cloak shenanigans, like Hadina, Slinking Sorcerer, this card just goes off. Atrada, Deadly Fugitive. This is like the best draw engine in my Atrada deck, for example, because every single assassin triggered ability for cloaking, each individual one was resolved separately. So each one of those cloaks triggers Satoru. So if I hit with like 4 assassins and cloak 4 times, I draw 4 cards off Satoru. This is just like, for 2 mana, this is one of the most insane draw engines in multiple archetypes. It's so good. All right, and now we have a new one for Rakdos Sacrifice lovers. This is Alicia Who Laughs at Fate. This is a 3 mana Rakdos legendary creature, human warrior. It's a 2/2 for first strike. Whenever it attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it and has raid. At the beginning of your end step, if you attack this turn, return target creature card with mana value less than or equal to Alicia's power from your graveyard to the battlefield. So if you're in a sacrifice deck that has a low curve, Alicia's just basically every single turn you get to reanimate for no mana. Every single turn you get to reanimate for no mana. That's very powerful. You don't even need to like attack with Alicia too, right? Like if you attack with Alicia, then yeah, she grows and she can reanimate bigger creatures from the graveyard, but you don't need to do that. There's going to be plenty of things, 1 mana, 2 mana already to reanimate every single turn. You just have to attack with something. Just attack with your sacrifice fodder, let it die, and then that triggers Alicia afterwards too. So obviously things like Accursed Marauder is a fantastic reanimate target for Alicia. You make everybody sacrifice something, then on end step, raid triggers if you attacked, and boom, you bring back Marauder, everybody has to sacrifice something again. Inti is another really good one with Alicia, especially if Alicia is your commander. Like, it's a great commander, by the way. You can attack with Inti on the battlefield. You essentially grow Alicia by 2 +1/+1 counters instead of 1 if you discard a card, and you discard reanimate target. It's all good stuff. But you can also just run Alicia in the 99 of other Rakdos Aristocrats decks. Like, I have a Cardor Doomscourge deck, and this is just a fantastic card in the 99. Everith, Viceroy of Plunder, is another new one. This is Alicia's excellent in the 99. So it's an excellent commander, also excellent in the 99. Just a really fantastic reanimation engine. There's a lot of really good multicolor cards that I just didn't have time to talk about in depth. Aurelia the Law Above is really good for Go Wide. Inquisitive Glimmer is really good for Enchantress. Repulsive Mutation is nice protection and Go Tall. And Doc Urlock is fantastic mana discount for Exile Matter style decks in Simic colors. All right, final category, the colorless cards. Cards that can fit in any deck. We've kicked things off with probably the most played land on Commander Clash now. It's obviously Arid Archway. It's a land desert that enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you return a land you control to its owner's hand. If another desert was returned this way, surveil 1, and you can tap it at 2 colorless mana. So it's a bounce land, and as I've mentioned in the white section, it's just so good enabling white catch-up ramp. Like Sand Scout tutors it up even. It allows you to continue playing lands, but not going up in land count, so it doesn't actually hinder your white catch-up ramp. And there are also some other non-white use case scenarios like Surveyor's Scope, which can go into any deck and very much appreciates more balanced lanes to work with. And the other desert I mentioned earlier with Sand Scout, Lazotep Quarry. It's a desert that taps for colorless. You can also tap it to sacrifice a creature, add 1 mana of any color, and you can pay X and 2 and tap it and sacrifice a desert. Exile target creature card with mana value X from your graveyard. Create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 4/4 black zombie. Activate only as a sorcery. So you can basically eternalize any creature in your graveyard by sacrificing a desert and paying its mana cost +2 and tapping it. The main that secondary ability I don't use that much. It's really about the fact that this is essentially a superior high market, right? You're not gaining the life when you're sacrificing a creature. You're just mana fixing. So it's not strictly better, but the fact that it also is a desert, so it's easily tutored up, and it also has eternalize ability, just makes it an easy swap in for high market for me. Honestly, if I'm in an Aristocrats deck and I really need sack outlets and I'm running both, but the fact that you can tutor up the quarry with Sand Scout or whatever, and it also has an eternalize effect too late game, is just so good. This card is just so good for any sacrifice deck. So obviously it's a desert, so it's even better in desert-based decks. But basically anything that is like sacrifice focus like Teysa Karlov is going to love Lazotep Quarry. You just run that alongside your high markets and whatnot. Then we got a really powerful new equipment, Pip-Boy 3000. It's a 1-mana artifact equipment. Whenever a quick creature attacks, choose one. Either draw a card, then discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, or untap up to 2 target lands. It has an equip cost of 2. So for me, the most powerful ability here by far is the last one, untap up to 2 target lands. Other ones, they're good and they're useful in various ways, but I think the highest power ceiling on all of them is untapping 2 target lands, because there's going to be a bunch of lands that you can play with this that tap for more than just 1 mana, right? So by itself, if you're untapping like 2 basics with Pip-Boy, it's essentially ramping you 2 mana each turn, which is already really good, already very good, but it just gets even more ridiculous once you're like untapping Arid Archway, which taps for 2 mana. So now if you untap Arid Archway and like a basic land, you're making 3 extra mana each turn when you're attacking with Pip-Boy. But it gets even more ridiculous if you have like Nykthos Shrine of Nyx or Cabal Coffers or whatever, which can tap way more than just 2 mana or 1 mana each turn. So Pip-Boy is just like insane ramp potential in any deck, really. It's especially good in decks that you can actually build around, like Ishin, 2 Heavens of Run. Instead of getting 1 attack trigger with Pip-Boy, you get double that. Sir Gwyn, Hero of Ashvale, is an equipment deck, so you can equip it for 0 onto your knights. That's also really good. So yeah, Pip-Boy is very flexible and has multiple homes for it. Then we have a sweet new land that offers up some very mana efficient protection. It's Diamond City. It's a land that enters the battlefield with a shield counter on it, and it taps for colorless, and you can tap it to move a shield counter from Diamond City onto a target creature. Activate only if 2 or more creatures enter the battlefield under your control this turn. So notably, this is a land that doesn't tap for colored mana. That's kind of boo, but it enters the battlefield untapped, which is yay, and its activated ability of a shield counter doesn't cost any mana, right? Like you just tap the Diamond City and then you move the shield counter over. So essentially it costs like 1 mana for you, but it doesn't cost a lot of mana. And its stipulation is just have 2 creatures entering the battlefield under your control this turn. And a lot of decks can actually do that. So basically if you're any sort of go wide deck like Arabella, Abandoned Doll, why not run an additional way of protecting your commander for very low mana cost and very low cost to you in general, right? Why wouldn't you just run another way of protecting your commander, protecting your important creatures for such a low cost investment? It's just an untapped colorless land essentially that you're risking with this. And then obviously things get even better if you are in a proliferate deck. Like if you manage to proliferate the shield counter on Diamond City a bunch of times in like a Venser deck, like I own a Venser deck and I do exactly just that, then you can repeatedly put shield counters on all your creatures, maybe multiple times, and then they're just really hard to kill. You really need like an exile effect or a bounce effect to actually deal with that creature if it has like 5 shield counters on it, which I have actually done in my Venser deck before. So yeah, Diamond City, really good. The cost of getting this value is very, very low. It's an untapped colorless land. Its activated ability costs very minimal amounts of mana to do. It's a very low hoop to jump through. It's just very good. And obviously, 2024 was a very good year for colorless decks, especially Eldrazi decks. So like, if you're an Eldrazi deck or any sort of colorless focused deck like morph decks and cloak decks or whatnot, you got a bunch of really sweet cards to play with. Echoes of Eternity is like a Panharmonicon for you. Glaring Fleshraker just poops out Eldrazi spawns, which are just extra tokens that you can also sacrifice for mana. And it also doubles as a finisher. It like pings your opponents super efficiently too. And then Breaker Creation, yeah, it's 8 mana. It's a lot of mana. But its cast trigger gains you a ton of life. And it's an 8/4 of Annihilator too. And it has hexproof from each color. Like that's a lot of value for an 8-drop. So obviously it's a slam dunk in any Eldrazi deck for sure. But it's also really good in face down matters decks like Kadena. And it's also good in artifact decks that are very colorless heavy, like Urtet, for example. All 3 of those cards, really good in all 3 of these decks. Next, we have a new cycle of fetch lands, really. The budget fetch lands, essentially. They're the landscapes. They're all lands that tap for colorless, or you can crack them and search your library for 3 different basic, and you can cycle them for 3 mana, the 3 land colors that they're looking for. Now, these cards aren't auto-includes in 3 color decks or whatever, but they are good budget fixing. They get the job done. They're better than like an Evolving Wilds or whatever in your 3 color decks or 4 color decks. But they also have extra value in specific styles of decks. For example, if you're in like a self-mill deck, if you like Karam, for example, if you want to put lands in the graveyard to get them out later of Karam, that's very good. Or any sort of like landfall deck, like Omnath, Locus of Creation. It is a land that immediately can crack and get another land onto the battlefield. So that's 2 landfall triggers for the price of 1 card. And then they also put themselves in the graveyard. So, you know, graveyard-based decks like Lord of Windgrace are also going to get a lot of value out of these cards. So maybe they're not like as good as the original fetches or whatever, but like the onside fetches, but they have a significant role, and you're probably going to run them alongside the other fetches in 3 color decks. Okay, now we're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. Panoptic Projector, it's only good for face down matters decks, so there's only 2 of them, Kadena and Kaust, but like obviously, if you're going to have a Kaust deck and you have the precon, you already have this card because it came with the precon. But if you're in Kadena deck and you were looking for another upgrade and you just missed the new cards from last year, get the Panoptic Projector. It's very good. And then we got Seance Board. I'm on the fence about this card. It's a 2 mana colorless artifact. It has Morbid. At the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, put a soul counter on Seance Board. And you can tap it, add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of soul counters on Seance Board. Spend this mana only to cast instant sorcery, demon, and spirit spells. You really want to have this in a deck that you sacrifice your own creatures at least once per turn, which often isn't what Spellslinger is doing. Or I guess like spirits and demons don't do that too much either, I don't think. But there are some homes for it, like Kaikar Wind's Fury. You're pooping out spirits and you're sacrificing them for ramp. So obviously Seance Board is going to be really, really good there. And on Halo the Painter is also like sacrifice meets Spellslinger. So I think Halo is another easy include for a Seance Board in there. But I don't think it's like just like a shoo-in in like any style like Spellslinger deck. Or you really want to be sacrificing a creature on your own turn to really utilize Seance Board consistently, instead of like relying on your opponent's creatures dying all the time. All right, and then the last card to mention is probably one of the most popular colorless cards from the year. It's Lava Spur Boots. It's a 1 mana artifact equipment, and it says a quick creature gets +1/+0 and has haste and ward 1, and it has equip 1. So this card is basically the next iteration of Swiftfoot Boots / Lightning Greaves, I guess. Swiftfoot Boots is 2 mana and equip 1, whereas Lava Spur Boots is 1 mana equip 1. However, the Lava Spore Boots trades out Hexproof for just ward 1 and +1/+0, and they both give haste. So they both have their pros and cons. I think if you're looking for protection, Swiftfoot Boots is way better. Obviously, Hexproof is way better than ward 1. Ward 1 is pretty payable, right? It's pretty payable. However, Lava Spore Boots is cheaper to cast, which is nice. And it does pump up the creature's power. So if you're caring more about the haste aspect of Lava Spore Boots and not so much about the protection, I think the boots, the Lava Spore boots, are better. But if you're running the card mostly for protection, then Swiftfoot boots is better. So it really depends on what you're actually running the card for. And also, Lava Spore boots also has additional synergy potential that makes it better in Swiftfoot boots in certain decks. For example, it's a 1-drop, so you can actually tutor it up with Urza Saga, which is nice. And there are also commanders that require haste and also want to boost up their power. For example, Obika Splitter Seconds has a combat damage trigger that gets more powerful the more power Obika has. So you want to give her haste and you want to pump up her power. So Lava Spore boots in that case is actually better than Swiftfoot boots. So that was a fairly exhaustive list of my favorite budget cards that were printed in 2024. Hopefully that helps you if you haven't been following every single card printed last year, which even as a professional Magic content creator, I don't even know all the cards. I'm paid to do this. But yeah, let me know which cards I missed out of all those cards that I talked about. Which are your favorite cards that I didn't talk about from this whole list from last year? And good luck checking your bulk for these cards, because yeah, they're very sweet and hopefully I sold you on some of them. So until next time, friends, see ya.